Gnosticism is a unique philosophical movement from the early centuries of Christianity, where the traditional Bible stories were rewritten so that the Old Testament God is portrayed as evil, the serpent from the Garden of Eden is portrayed as something of a hero, and in some cases, the serpent is even equated with Jesus Christ. While this may seem almost like an inversion of Christianity, it actually has its roots in the earlier Greek mythology that preceded it. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, or knowledge, and was a movement that focused on the idea of escaping your reincarnation cycle here in the mortal realm by attaining a spiritual enlightenment and ascending to the mystical world above ours. This gnosis was multi-layered, involving a sense of personal development and growth in relation to a greater understanding of the material world and your place in it with its history. To that point, Gnosticism was known to have made many different texts that reference or even entirely reimagine the Christian Bible stories, with what they claim to be the true version of these stories. In these stories, the Old Testament God is presented as an ignorant deity known as the Demiurge, Greek for architect. The Old Testament God is given the title of Demiurge because he is the architect of our material universe, but he is unaware of the spiritual worlds above him and the emanations of light that exist there. In Gnosticism, the physical world is the lowest level of reality, and with the Demiurge being the supreme being within the physical world and unaware of the spiritual worlds above, he sees himself as the supreme God, and he desires to be worshipped as a result. To do this, he creates the humans, but in order to animate them, he has to use the light of creation itself, which he does not realize comes from beings in the spiritual world above him, such as Sophia. Sophia is Greek for wisdom, and in the stories of Gnosticism, she is what we might think of as an angel, being described as one of the many emanations of divinity coming from the highest of all gods known as the Monad, a sleeping unreachable god above all of spiritual creation in the highest realm of all. Sophia's light becomes trapped in our material world for different reasons in the various Gnostic texts, but it generally comes from Sophia's prideful attempts to be like the Monad above or to reach him in some way. When trapped in the material world, Sophia is shattered across the many descendants of Adam and Eve, who the Demiurge is constantly trying to keep ignorant of their origins. Jesus is sent not as the son of the Old Testament God, but as the son of the greater God who exists above all else, that Monad. With the Monad being a sleeping entity, Jesus the Christ is his active agent who can descend all the way down to the material world to correct existence and help lost emanations like Sophia return to their proper state above. The texts each present the key narrative of Sophia in different ways, with there not being a canon to the stories, but rather the stories being metaphor for historical events that the Gnostics did not have all of the physical details for. Deep in our past, we couldn't write things down, and mythology became the way to record history whose importance wasn't always understood at the time of its happening. By the time a certain event became understood as deeply important to a culture, a lot of the details were already forgotten, and myth and metaphor would help fill in the gaps of what they didn't actually know. This is most obvious with stories like Noah's Ark, which is part of a tradition of flood myths found all over the world. These stories all point to a real flood and even a great conflict between peoples before the flood, but since most of the details about those cultures were lost, the vague ideas had to be explained with metaphorical characters such as the gods in polytheism, or figures like the patriarchs or fallen angels in Judaism. These simplified stories were also a lot easier for people to understand who didn't have what we think of as education today. It was by comparing the flood myths of different cultures that allowed researchers, historians, and philosophers for thousands of years now to piece together our more universal history with what these myths not just have in common, but also how they differ. Gnosticism was a response to early Christianity in that it rejected the perspective of the Old Testament where it differed from their local Greek mythology. With that in mind, Gnosticism is a part of a tradition that purposely creates texts that tell the same story in different ways so that you can apply the same logic to the world mythologies and see how each text gives a unique perspective on the same kind of events. The most diverse pairing of these texts would be the Apocryphon of John, which was written closer to the beginning of the movement, and Pistis Sophia written closer to the end of the movement. The Apocryphon of John is believed to have been written sometime in the 2nd century after Christ. The Apocalypse, or Revelation, is given to the Apostle John by Jesus after he has ascended back to heaven, with Jesus giving John the true version of the Book of Genesis narrative in his more spiritual form. This text goes on to retell Genesis with the Old Testament God being presented as that ignorant Demiurge who tries to trap the spirit of Sophia in the human flesh of Adam within the false paradise of the Garden of Eden. In this story, Jesus claims that he is the one who tempted Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of forbidden knowledge, as that knowledge specifically was what set Adam and Eve free from the delusions of the Demiurge. This equates Jesus with the serpent who was said to trick Adam and Eve, with Jesus explaining that the real serpent, or trickster in this case, is the Demiurge. Due to Jesus convincing Adam and Eve to eat the fruit of forbidden knowledge, the two of them are able to escape the false paradise of Eden, but still find themselves subjected to the torments of the Demiurge, leading to the flood he sends in an attempt to stop humanity from overcoming him. Pistis Sophia tells a story with these same ideas, but without rehashing the biblical narrative. This text, dated to about the 4th century after Christ, focuses on Jesus as he ascends from earth and up through the heavens as part of his mission to restore balance on every level of creation. It is at the outer edge of our physical dimension, leading up to the next spiritual dimension, that Jesus finds Sophia. Sophia's story here is that she was living in a more divine realm between the physical and spiritual realm called the 13th Eon. However, after wanting to be like the light of the monad in the worlds above, Sophia is tricked into falling into the material world below, finding a light there that she thought could help her reach the monad. This light is the trick of a Demiurge figure who ends up devouring Sophia's light, making her a fated fallen angel stuck in the lower 12 eons, trying to hide away from the monsters of physical creation that were made to chase after her. Jesus is not allowed to help Sophia until she repents 9 times, at which point Jesus is allowed to raise her to a higher state just outside the 13th eon, until he can correct creation entirely and return Sophia to her rightful place. These two stories do focus on the same basic idea of Sophia's fall and rescue by Christ, Sophia herself being a bit of a metaphor. According to Pistis Sophia, the material world is not the creation of Sophia like it is in the Apocryphon of John, but rather a natural outer edge of the spiritual realities. As Jesus makes his way upwards through the dimensions, a lot of the correction he does involves the process of filtration for souls in the material world up to the divine realms above. Here, the divine light from above is presented as coming down to the material world in a much more natural way, with the actual issue here being that the rulers of the physical reality, the archons, are impeding the process so that the divine sparks cannot raise themselves to back above. Sophia's natural place is in the realm above the material, but she and the light of divinity as a whole are becoming trapped in the material world by those archons. The Demiurge becomes the chief of these misleading archons, all working to prevent the proper light from returning above. While the narrative paints Sophia as a singular entity who needs to be restored to her completion, the broader tradition of Gnosticism paints her more so as a representation for our failure to reach this higher state of enlightenment earlier. The story of Pistis Sophia itself is told by Jesus to his disciples, but following the actual narrative, Jesus' discussion with the disciples continues, where he answers questions about Gnostic lore in much more direct terms, dropping the metaphor of Sophia. With Sophia dropped as a character, Jesus explains that the purification process is to fill up what he calls the Treasury of Light. The Treasury of Light is something like a heaven, but specifically for beings who align themselves with Christ. Jesus warns that there is actually a limited number of spaces in the Treasury of Light, and tells the reader not to waste their time in this life thinking they can find gnosis and enlightenment in the next one, as they might simply end up being left behind when the Treasury of Light becomes full. The Treasury of Light is even explained as being the reason for the creation of existence, essentially the end goal for our physical world. Sophia thus is not one being shattered into a finite number of pieces with each having to be returned properly, but rather some humans can be left behind simply because there is only so much room in this Treasury of Light, which isn't actually a place that we descended from as one particular being. This idea of a Treasury of Light is extremely similar to what is described in the book of Revelations from the actual Bible. Revelations is of course known for its end times prophecies and dark symbolism. In chapter 5, Revelations describes a slaughtered lamb being the only one worthy of opening the seals of the apocalypse. This is believed to be a representation of Jesus Christ, who is depicted as a slain lamb because of his crucifixion on the cross. Each seal brings different disasters upon the earth, but the 5th seal is set aside for later, when a correct number of brothers and sisters have been slain like the martyred souls who died in the name of the true religion. This appears to be the same idea as the Treasury of Light, a place with limited space but that pure souls have filtered up to, the completion of which is said to bring about the apocalypse and other Gnostic texts such as the Gospel of Judas. In the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, there is no Sophia, and instead, Jesus is presented as the figure that needs to be killed in order to ascend back up, his final death being what unleashes the apocalyptic events described in Revelations. Sophia becomes a sort of metaphor for the aspect of humanity that lost this information about its own ascent, something attributed to the archons of reality, the higher celestial beings who rule over the physical universe, and are said to have delayed this filtration process so that they can delay the Treasury of Light's fulfillment and remain our rulers. Sophia's inclusion allows the humans to feel a bit more divine, but still not godlike. As an emanation, or an angel if you will, Sophia allows the same divine commentary that the gods did in polytheistic pantheons, while keeping your attention on the worship of the God Most High and Jesus Christ himself. Sophia is Greek for wisdom, with it being common to personify wisdom in various cultures, often as a god. Even in the Old Testament, wisdom, or Chokmah, is described as being with God when he created the world in the book of Proverbs. Here, wisdom begs the people to heed their warnings and live noble lives. The personification of Chokmah would also appear in the book of Parables from the book of Enoch. While Enoch is known for focusing largely on the story of the fallen angels, the Book of Parables presents a series of metaphors that connect to the Enochian narrative. Here, wisdom is described as looking for a dwelling place among the humans, but after not finding one, having to return to her throne in the world above. This is seen as paralleling the story of the fallen angels who came down to give wisdom to the humans of Earth, but ended up rebelling against God and giving humans forbidden knowledge, leading to God deciding on the destruction of the angels and their descendants. These fallen angels of Enoch held a story very similar to the serpent of the Garden of Eden, both being givers of forbidden knowledge who are ultimately punished by God. When translated to the Greek, these passages would render wisdom as Sophia, and she had developed something of a character in the minds of certain Greek philosophers, particularly those who would go on to start the Gnostic movement. One of the most interesting concepts in Gnosticism is the idea of the Old Testament God being not just evil, but a lower-level entity instead of the God of all existence, with Gnosticism having a greater sleeping God high above them that all lower entities descend from. The demonization of another culture's god is not unheard of, and even in polytheistic worship, foreign gods can still be venerated, prayed to, and even sacrificed to, while still being demonized. Judaism itself had done this with the gods of other religions while transitioning itself from polytheism to monolatry, or the worship of one god in a larger pantheon, to real monotheism in the end, with other gods being demoted and demonized. The gods of other religions were turned to the entities we call the sons of God from the Bible and the Enochian tradition. The sons of God were those fallen angels discussed earlier from the book of Enoch. In the original Hebrew, they were called the sons of God, or B'nai Elohim. This is similar to the term B'nai Elim from the Canaanite mythology that Judaism grew out of. In the Canaanite tradition, the B'nai Elim were a group of gods that descended from the chief god El, who generally represented tribes of people the same way we think of Athena as the daughter of Zeus representing Athens, or Ares the son of Zeus representing Sparta. Now, in the book of Enoch, the sons of God were portrayed as more advanced beings than the early humans, teaching them how to build proper societies with skills like using the stars to track the seasons. They represented more advanced societies that had risen to power deep in our past, and had become rulers of the physical world, not that different from the Demiurge and his icons. This trend of demotion and demonization can be traced back to even before that, to the time of Babylon. There, they had the story of Inanna, which holds quite a few similarities to the story of Sophia. In this story, Inanna descends into the underworld through 7 gates, mirroring the descent of Sophia into the material world. When Inanna ends up trapped there, the god Enki has to send someone to rescue Inanna and bring her back to the world of the gods, just as the monad sends Jesus to rescue Sophia in Gnosticism. Whereas the material world is ruled by the archons in Gnostic texts like Pistis Sophia, the underworld Inanna descends into is ruled by the dark Anunnaki, different than the Anunnaki we think of as being gods like Enki in the Babylonian pantheon. Like the Archons, these evil Anunnaki rule over the fates of souls that pass through to the underworld, and the underworld is shown to have become corrupt with how they do their work, orchestrating to trap Inanna there so she can't return home, just as the Archons trap the Divine Light and Sophia herself. This sort of demonization allowed for a culture to depict another culture as rising to power and having a sort of controlling influence over them, being the controllers of reality instead of some sort of demonic god who is just attacking you. When it comes to the Old Testament God, the Gnostics represented his actions not as the true creator of our universe, but like with their own mythologies, they saw the Old Testament God as an application of Israelite history to a supposed all-powerful being. To emphasize this, the Demiurge repeats the lines of the Old Testament God in some of these Gnostic texts, saying that there are no other gods but him, but not realizing that he's just one of many cosmic entities. The Greeks already had a fascination with monotheism before Christianity became its chief religion, but in an attempt to embrace a more pure idea of monotheism, they did not place their own god or gods as the chief god above all else in the Gnostic pantheon. Instead, even their savior Christ is depicted as the son of the highest god, a sleeping entity of pure love who has no real history, and instead represents the divinity of all peoples. It is a pure being of love that represents no culture, with the Greek gods instead being converted to emanations, particularly Sophia. The Gnostics seem to even hold reverence for the idea that the Old Testament God's name is the name of the one true God above all else, which is an important part of Jewish tradition. For instance, we have one of the most interesting texts in Gnosticism, the Book of Jew, or the Book of EU. This is a very complex writing that goes into the nature of the afterlife and gives the reader code words involved with passing to the different treasuries as you make your ascent. It relies heavily on the idea of the name of God, which in many traditions is believed to be a series of simple vowels lined up together, such as EU or Yahweh or Yah-O. This is a concept found not just in Greece, but India and throughout the ancient world, but which is recorded most interestingly in the Old Testament, with a lot of Jewish tradition being surrounded about the idea of this God's true name. The name Yahweh is actually forbidden to be spoken or even read in your mind in Jewish tradition, with public readings of the Torah substituting the appearance of this name with Adonai, meaning Lord, or Hashem, meaning the name. The only time this name is allowed to be said is in a special ritual on Yom Kippur by the high priest conducting the ceremony. In the Book of Jew, this name seems to be used to describe the monad, that highest of all gods, his name being an important part of meditation to reach the higher spiritual realms. In the text, the God of Jew is not described as just being the true God, but as being the one that will be called the true God, the God of the Jews even, showing a reverence for this tradition within its original context. While Gnosticism seems like an inversion of Christianity, it is actually just a rearranging of its key symbols to parallel the story told in Greek mythology, particularly that of Zeus and Prometheus. Greek mythology does not have one unified source, but one of the earliest attempts at this came from Hesiod's Theogony from the 8th century before Christ. Theos meaning God and gene meaning genealogy, it reads surprisingly similar to the Book of Genesis with its many genealogies of patriarchs that would come a few centuries later. Unlike the Old Testament, where foreign gods were often turned into figures like the serpent or patriarchs, Theogony has all of those figures still as gods, giants, nymphs, and other mystical beings. The genealogy of the gods is a framework used to show how the various tribes of people connect through their deities in the Greek tradition, and begins with tales of beings who existed in the ancient times before what we call the Great Titan War. At this time, the 12 great titans ruled the world, representing the powers that controlled civilization until the Olympians rose up and defeated them. The Olympians were led by Zeus, the god of thunder. Zeus was the son of Kronos, who was the leader of the Titans, but he did not defeat Kronos and the Titans alone. Instead, he was helped by the other children of the Titans, including his brothers Poseidon and Hades, but also the children of other Titans. The key figure in this case is Prometheus, who was the son of another Titan, Iapetus. Prometheus helped Zeus fight against the Titans, and is interestingly portrayed as being the creator of humans in this Greek narrative, though there are often different accounts for this involving other gods. In the case of Theogony, like with many mythologies, the god responsible for creating humans in this narrative is actually the god that the narrative claims the local people themselves come from. With gods representing tribes of people in the past, the creation of humans was often the creation of a new tribe that was meant to serve the gods. In Greek myth, Prometheus is said to create the humans in order to serve the gods, similar to Adam and Eve being created in the book of Genesis to tend to the Garden of Eden for Yahweh and the other Elohim. In early Mesopotamian mythology, Enlil was the chief god of the pantheon, but Enki was the deity who was said to create humans. However, when the cities of Sumeria eventually fell to the power of Babylon, Babylon would revise that mythology so that Enki's son Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, would be the one who created humans instead. Greek mythology is similar to Sumerian mythology in that Prometheus and Enki are the creators of humans who end up loving them more than the chief god of their pantheons, which are Zeus and Enlil respectively. In Theogony, Prometheus loves the humans so much that he tricks Zeus into taking a portion of the food that the humans had prepared that are all fat and bone, leaving the actual meat for the humans to enjoy. Zeus saw that Prometheus cared about the humans more than he did about the gods, and was worried that Prometheus would give the secret of unwearying fire to the humans. This was a gift of forbidden knowledge, similar to that of the fruit of forbidden knowledge in Genesis. Prometheus steals this fire from the gods to give to the humans, and for this, both the humans and Prometheus are punished. In Theogony, Prometheus is chained to the earth, similar to the fallen angels of Enoch being thrown into the pit within the earth. Here, Prometheus is trapped in a cyclical punishment like the serpent. Well, God curses the serpent to bite at the heels of Eve's descendants, and for them to crush the head of the serpent's descendants, Zeus curses Prometheus so that an eagle comes and eats his liver every day, causing it to painfully regrow overnight. The story of Gnosticism, thus, really just reads as a recasting of the existing Greek narrative. Prometheus becomes the serpent in Genesis, and Zeus, the chief god, is recognized as Yahweh, the one true god in the Old Testament, whose tradition grew out of the worship of entities like the thunder god Baal from the Canaanite pantheon, Baal being a clear parallel to Zeus as thunder gods, both having a brother who rules the ocean and another brother who rules the underworld. In Greek mythology, Zeus represents the will of the universe when chaining Prometheus. Thus, it is also Zeus who promises that one day Zeus's own descendant will set Prometheus free, Heracles, or who we often call in the West, Hercules. Jesus, of course, takes this role in the Christian narrative, first being the son of Yahweh in mainstream Christianity, but becoming more so associated with the idea of a universal god instead of the tribal god of the Israelite peoples, whose tribal deity had somehow managed to not just be adopted by the Greeks, but eventually much of our modern world. Gnosticism was an interesting attempt to embrace Christianity then, while making it more universal in its monotheism. The Gnostics didn't just reduce the Old Testament God to a smaller entity symbolizing a tribal history, but their own gods as well, leaving the idea that at the end of the day, we all descend from one pure and perfect entity that represents us all. But Gnosticism is a much more complex movement than I could ever explain in a video this short, so please subscribe so you don't miss our future videos diving deeper on certain aspects of Gnostic lore, particularly breaking down their origins as a mystery school system that dates back to ancient Egypt and possibly even before. And be on the lookout for other esoteric deep dives on the world religions, and particularly the Bible. And for those who can't wait, consider checking out our Patreon. If you take the free membership offered there, you're able to get access to a lecture I put out about the genealogy of the gods from different religions and how they all relate. And if you sign up for early access, you'll get access to videos like this one before they actually air on the channel. And if you pay $25, you get access to a backlog of early drafts of different videos that I've been working on for a while now, with there being about 8 subjects so far, 4 of which are just breaking down different parts of the book of Genesis. Link is in the pinned comment down below, check it out if you haven't, and I'll see you guys next time.